I guess I still prefer you. Poor wife. Just married yesterday, my husband laughed at me with his mistress, making a fool of me. Caught off guard, I was speechless. I couldn't understand why he married me if he was having an affair, or what he was thinking when he proposed. But one thing was clear, I couldn't stay with him anymore. Please, do as you wish. Despite the turmoil, I was anything but calm inside, but I couldn't bear to deal with these two unreasonable people any longer. My name is Emily Johnson, 31 years old. I work in an office, and since starting my job, I've been going out more on weekends with colleagues and friends. Thanks to that, my hobbies have expanded from reading and watching movies to include more physical activities, making my life more fulfilling. Though my job is sedentary, I've become more active on weekends. I feel like I've gotten stronger since becoming a working adult. During this lifestyle, I met my husband, Michael, in my late 20s at a golf tournament I was invited to by a colleague. Michael loved golf and patiently taught me, a beginner at the time. We were the same age, which made it easy to talk, and that golf outing was really enjoyable. We didn't exchange contact information then, and I thought that would be the end of it. However, we kept bumping into each other when I went out and eventually exchanged numbers. We started dating as we realized we shared many hobbies and got along well. We dated for about 3 years, 2 of which we lived together. Then he proposed, and we began planning our wedding. When we moved in together, we decided I would cook and Michael would clean, which worked well. Michael liked things tidy and kept the house clean. But I had one issue with him: his obsession with hobbies. He enjoyed golf and cycling outdoors and gaming indoors. He also meticulously maintained his golf clubs and cycling gear. Sometimes, he would take over 30 minutes to come for dinner when called. I understood the feeling of getting caught up in something since it happened to me too. However, it was frustrating when meals got cold because he wouldn't come immediately. I understand my husband, Michael, likes to take care of his own equipment. Unlike me, who rents stuff as needed, he prefers owning and maintaining his own, which takes time. I get it because I play video games too, though not as much as him. I know how it feels to be so caught up in a game that you just can't stop. But there's a limit, you know? Hey, can you come to dinner before it gets cold? You can pause your game at a good spot in like 1 to 2 minutes, right? So, I've been reminding Michael frequently not to get too lost in his hobbies. I understand wanting to enjoy hobbies, but if that's too much, at least set aside specific times for them. Our meal times are pretty much fixed, so I asked him to plan his activities around that. We made sure to have our own time for hobbies, even when living together. But there were times, even when we were supposed to be spending time together, when Michael would be preoccupied with his hobbies and not fully engaged in our conversations. After it happened dozens of times, I reached my breaking point. Sorry, I just got too carried away. Michael would say, showing remorse, but he never really changed. He seemed to feel bad about it, always apologizing after I pointed it out. Sorry for always having to remind you. Despite this behavior from Michael, my irritation towards him would deflate. There were times when I felt anxious about going through with the marriage, thinking it was just his old habits and hoping he would change. Even though he didn't improve much after my reminders, I had no other complaints, so I decided to patiently keep pointing it out. Sometimes, Michael would suddenly go out for night cycling and return hours later. So late? Isn't it dangerous? Why don't you go tomorrow? I was worried because there's less visibility at night and more risk of accidents. It's fine. Plus, there are fewer people at night, so I can cycle as much as I want without worrying about bumping into anyone, he'd say, excitedly heading out. I was concerned when he would stay out for hours, but I knew the joy of hobbies and couldn't really stop him. I thought he probably wanted to enjoy his hobbies as much as possible now, knowing things would change once we had kids and he couldn't immerse himself as much. I frequently reminded him not to stay out too late, but I couldn't bring myself to stop him completely. Still, I was a bit worried about his deep involvement in his hobbies. But when we talked about our life after marriage, I felt I was worrying too much. Especially when we talked about kids, Michael seemed eager to spend time with them. He was also enthusiastic about planning our wedding, so I believed things would change after we got married. Our wedding preparations went smoothly, and we had a big ceremony after registering our marriage. We were blessed by colleagues, friends, and family, which made me very happy. Since Michael and I met through mutual friends and colleagues, many of our guests already knew our relationship, making the wedding celebration even more joyful. I remember smiling throughout the ceremony, feeling incredibly happy. We planned to go on our honeymoon a few days after the wedding. Though the wedding was fun, it was tiring, so we went to bed early that night, looking forward to our trip. I wondered if I'd be able to sleep with all the excitement, but I was more tired than I thought and fell asleep quickly. However, maybe because of what I was thinking before sleeping, I woke up much earlier than usual the next day. I woke up refreshed, but it was still around 4 a.m. I thought about going back to sleep, but then I realized Michael wasn't in bed. Thinking he might have woken up early too, I decided to get up and talk with him. As I left the room to find him, I heard voices in the living room and was curious. I thought he might be on the phone, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman's voice, not over the phone. That woke me up completely. A strange woman was in our house, talking with Michael, alone. Realizing this, the happiness I felt just moments ago turned ice cold. Nervous but driven, I burst through the door to see who Michael was with. In the room, there was Michael and an unfamiliar woman. Both fully dressed early in the morning, the woman with perfect makeup. She was quite beautiful and dressed in an elegant and feminine style. I was confused about why she was in our house, but had a bad feeling about it. "What's going on here?" I asked Michael coldly, surprised and confused. I had hoped it was just my overthinking, but my fears were quickly shattered. In response to my question, my husband Michael replied in a carefree, cheerful tone, saying something unbelievable. "I've decided to call off our marriage and marry her instead. I guess I still prefer my ex," he said, chuckling and putting his arm around the woman next to him. "Poor wife." The woman mocked me without any shame, chuckling as she looked down on me. "Huh?" I was dumbfounded. We had just gotten married yesterday, and here he was, saying such things. It took me a moment to grasp what he was saying, as it was so casually stated. As I began to comprehend his words, I doubted if this was the same man I had prepared for marriage with just yesterday. Stunned, I stared at Michael, who was behaving as usual. Looking at me, the woman, with a demeaning look, said, "Kind of feel sorry for the wife. But then, a wife who doesn't notice anything is questionable too." She then smugly started bragging about how close she and Michael were. According to her, she was Michael's ex-girlfriend, and they had reconnected by chance, leading to an affair that had been going on for a year. Indeed, that was around the time Michael suddenly started going on night cycling trips. His actions now made sense in retrospect, but at the time, I had only thought he was getting more into his hobbies. The idea that he was cheating was completely unexpected. "Michael has always been crazy about me," the ex-girlfriend boasted, flaunting her supposed superiority in beauty and charm. Indeed, in contrast to her well-dressed and made-up appearance, I was in my plain pajamas and makeup-free, which felt humiliating. Her words infuriated me, but the shock of learning about Michael's affair and being caught off guard in the morning left me speechless. However, I reassured myself that my character was definitely better than hers. But I couldn't understand why Michael proposed to me if he was cheating. As I pondered this, Michael scornfully said, "At first, you were nice and fun to be with, but you became too nagging. I'm tired of being with you." He went on about how great his ex was, and she looked triumphantly satisfied. Apparently, he didn't like being constantly reminded by me. This revelation made me realize Michael's true nature, and I felt no issue in deciding on divorce. While initially overwhelmed with sadness at being cheated on and criticized for my concern, I was now just astonished. I had loved Michael, but now I felt my feelings cooling rapidly, able to think about the situation with unexpected calmness. While I couldn't forgive him, I was relieved that there were no children involved between us. "Well, we just got married, but let's divorce. I'll need to explain the reasons to our acquaintances," I said calmly, thinking about what lay ahead. I felt a bit guilty about divorcing so soon after our wedding, celebrated by so many. The paperwork would be complicated since we were already registered, which was a bit disheartening. But considering the circumstances, it was clear who was at fault and who was behaving unreasonably. I was surprisingly composed. Though I was angry about Michael's affair, I knew others would support me, which was somewhat comforting. Then Michael shocked me further. "What are you talking about? I'm not getting a divorce." Despite saying he wanted to marry his mistress, his refusal to divorce was baffling. Huh? His casual statement made me wonder if bigamy had suddenly become legal in the US. His words made no sense, especially since we had seemed so compatible in hobbies and values. As I stood there confused, the two of them started talking as if they had a great idea. Michael, seemingly wanting to hide his affair, smugly suggested filing a missing person report. "You know, even if we don't file for divorce, it'll automatically happen after 3 years. You'll get sympathy and concern from everyone around you, and I can marry her without any trouble. It's perfect for both of us, right?" He was threatening me, suggesting I play the role of a pitiful woman abandoned right after marriage. Moreover, his win-win was clearly a loss for me. He seemed oblivious to the fact that he was asking me to waste 3 years for his sake. It's bad optics to divorce so soon after getting married, right? The ex-girlfriend said, smugly agreeing with Michael, thinking she was being considerate. I felt like I was looking at two aliens with their bizarre logic. Leaving me dumbstruck, the two of them, satisfied with their plan, hurriedly got up to leave the house. "Then go ahead and file a missing person report." Disgusted with their reasoning and realizing it was pointless to talk further, I, exhausted from the morning's events, sighed and said, "Please, do whatever you want." When I said that, they seemed to think I had accepted their proposal and happily left the house together. After they left the house, I was initially stunned by the rapid turn of events, but I knew I couldn't afford to be lost in thought. I had to focus on what lay ahead. Regaining my composure, I quickly started making plans for the future. Then, suddenly, I heard, "Hey, what are you doing? I know you're there. Open up." 3 days later, my husband Michael, who had run away on a whim, stormed back into the house. In a frenzy and clearly not in his right mind, he was accompanied by his ex-girlfriend, who seemed quite confused. "What brings you here, the man who cheated and left?" Anticipating Michael might return, I remained calm and did not open the door, responding through it instead. Annoyed by my response, Michael yelled, "Don't mess with me! You haven't sold my stuff, have you?" In fact, after he left, I had gathered all of Michael's belongings, intending to sell them as compensation for his infidelity and disturbance. If he had no intention of returning, I figured it wouldn't be a problem to sell them. I had taken photos of his packed items and emailed him about my intention to sell them. These were items he had treasured, so it was a bit of retaliation for his thoughtless actions. I thought he might not notice since he was planning to go missing, but he quickly responded in a panic, which I ignored. Despite his subsequent emails pleading not to sell, throw away, or asking to have them sent, I felt no obligation to heed the words of a cheating husband. That's why he came to the house in such a frenzy today. Realizing I had no intention of opening the door, Michael, who apparently had a key, entered the house on his own, pushed past me, and immediately began checking and moving out his belongings. "Good, everything's here." Relieved to see his gaming console, golf equipment, and mountain bike all intact, Michael was visibly pleased. Some items were quite expensive, worth thousands of dollars, so his joy at finding them all was evident. I was dismayed that he prioritized possessions over everything else, even though he had talked about disappearing. Watching Michael frantically check his belongings, I felt an additional chill toward him. "Did you really come back just for these things?" I thought, not the only one feeling this way, as the ex-girlfriend looked at him with a cold gaze. She had not expected Michael to prioritize his belongings over their future together. Although Michael told her to help, she just stood there, stunned. Then, voices at the open front door caught my attention. "Good morning, Emily. We came to help." "Good morning. Is everything okay? Why is the door wide open?" My in-laws had planned to visit today, but Michael and his ex-girlfriend, unaware of this, panicked and tried to hide, but it was too late. Before they could hide, my in-laws entered the house. Seeing my husband Michael, who wasn't supposed to be there, they exclaimed in surprise. "You! What are you doing here? Do you realize what you've done to Emily?" You've caused trouble for everyone. I had already informed my family and friends that Michael had cheated and run away. I also reported that he said to file a missing person report. Initially skeptical, my in-laws began to believe it when they couldn't get in touch with their son and learned about his affair. My parents had come yesterday to help with moving preparations, and today it was my in-laws' turn. I had told them I didn't want to live in a house that reminded me of my cheating husband, and they, apologizing for their son's behavior, kindly offered to help. I had always had a good relationship with my in-laws. I often stayed at their house, joining them for their health walks, cooking with my mother-in-law, and playing board games, which was my father-in-law's hobby. They were delighted when Michael and I first visited to announce our marriage. Once, while spending time with them, my mother-in-law let slip why they were so happy about our marriage. It was because of Michael's ex-girlfriend, who had previously been a topic of marriage discussion. She was overly possessive, often storming in on Michael regardless of time or place. Additionally, she was rude to my in-laws, speaking to them disrespectfully. Her bad behavior led my in-laws to oppose the marriage, but it only made the two of them more stubborn about it. So, they were trying to go against my in-laws' wishes and get married. But the ex-girlfriend had been overly clingy to Michael from the start, making it uncomfortable for him at work, and eventually, he had to change jobs because of her, leading to their breakup. As I listened to my mother-in-law speaking about the ex-girlfriend and her outrageous behavior, I couldn't say much more than nod in agreement. That's why we were so happy when Emily became our daughter-in-law. Thank you so much, she said sincerely, making me realize how much they must have struggled at the time. Having already heard this from her, when Michael ran off with his ex, I knew he was too simple-minded for me to handle, which made it easy for me to decide on the divorce. My in-laws, who had been so happy about our marriage, were understandably furious with their son's disgraceful behavior. Upon finding Michael in the house, they immediately began scolding their irresponsible son. And he, intimidated by their presence, meekly sat down on the floor. Meanwhile, the ex-girlfriend, seeming to have had enough of Michael, tried to sneak out of the house with a pale face. "Where do you think you're going?" I called out loudly as she attempted to escape alone. "This has nothing to do with me. I'm returning Michael to you," she said in a fluster, trying to leave, but my in-laws caught her and began scolding her alongside Michael. After my in-laws thoroughly reprimanded them, I declared that they would both have to compensate for the affair. "I'll be expecting a substantial amount in damages for the affair." Though I was too shocked to say anything when they eloped, I wanted them to fully atone for what they had done. Additionally, my anger towards my husband's attitude and his affair had only grown over these 3 days. I was determined not to be lenient with him anymore. To fulfill this, I stood imposingly before the two of them with a cold voice and announced my demand for alimony. At the word alimony, they seemed quite surprised, as if they hadn't expected it. "What? Alimony?" Their shock, as if they had never considered it, only fueled my anger further. And when I mentioned the going rate for alimony, they panicked and began to say they couldn't pay. "We don't have that kind of money, and there's no need to pay." I knew that Michael had been pouring most of his salary, beyond what was needed for living expenses, into his hobbies. I had warned him several times during our cohabitation, but he always said he wanted to spend on his hobbies until we were married. Still, since we started dating, he had begun to save a bit, so I didn't push too hard, hoping things would change after marriage. My husband, faced with the prospect of paying alimony, disliked the idea so much he turned pale, contemplating borrowing money or selling his possessions. "No way! I'll be broke." His ex-girlfriend, too, seemed to have little savings and started saying she didn't want to pay. When my in-laws glared at the two of them sharply, they became quiet and looked down, seemingly frightened. To add insult to injury, I told them about the past 3 days. "Also, everyone who attended our wedding knows about your affair. Don't expect to live like before." "What? No way!" At our wedding, there were people from Michael's company and friends from his student days. When they heard about his elopement after the affair, they were very angry, and he had no one on his side. "My life is ruined because of you. What are you gonna do about it?" Then he started lashing out at his ex-girlfriend. "What? Blaming me? You were the one who said you wanted to marry me." So, they began to argue and blame each other, starting a huge fight. Both quick to blame others when things went south, they were a perfect match in that regard, and their arguments were equally at fault. Nothing good comes from being with you. I shouldn't have gotten involved. That's my line. You've messed up my life. Just a few days ago, these two were close enough to elope, but now, without any remorse, they were angrily blaming each other. Despite being engaged and married to me, Michael chose his ex-girlfriend. There was a problem with her too, knowing it was an affair yet still dating him. The two of them, always blaming others without reflecting on their actions, seemed to deserve each other. Watching their foolish fight, I could only look on in dismay. Later, Michael completely lost the trust of his company due to this incident and his unexplained absence. He had a position but didn't contact anyone and seemed intent on disappearing, angering many for his lack of responsibility. It was natural since his 3-day disappearance had caused trouble for other employees. As a result, he was demoted and soon left the company because it became uncomfortable for him. Friends drifted away, and soon no one was approaching him. Later, with no income and little savings, Michael grumbled about the alimony, but with my in-laws watching, he ended up paying in full. Once the payment was confirmed, I was relieved that I wouldn't have to see my husband again. His ex-girlfriend initially tried to avoid paying alimony and was unresponsive to contact. So, I had no choice but to find her parents, explain the situation in a detailed letter, and include evidence of the affair. They soon contacted me at the number I provided in the letter, apologizing and agreeing to pay the alimony. It seemed the ex-girlfriend had returned to her parents' house and was scolded by them. Thus, the alimony was successfully paid, and I was able to divorce, but for a while, I felt uncomfortable due to the sympathy of those around me who knew the situation. However, things have settled down, and I'm back to living as I did before marriage. I haven't met or contacted my ex-husband since the divorce, but I maintain a good relationship with my former in-laws. By the way, my ex-husband, scolded severely by his parents until the divorce, is now in a near-disowned state and has moved to a distant place. Now, my relationship with my ex-in-laws is like that of good friends with a significant age gap, enjoying hobbies together. Later, I heard through the grapevine that my ex-husband, blaming his hobbies, is living a poor life. It seems he still blames everything but his own disrespectful and irrational behavior. I used to think marriage would change him, but now I'm glad I divorced such an impossible ex-husband. In hindsight, there were signs of his true nature during our cohabitation, and I regret not realizing it before we got married. It was a tough ordeal, but I'm relieved that I discovered his true self before we had kids and was able to leave him. Next time, if I consider marriage, I won't optimistically assume that marriage will change troubling behaviors. Instead, I'll be sure to thoroughly assess the person. I now relish the freedom of living alone, without needing to keep an eye on my ex-husband.